Hi everyone, and welcome to this video which goes through the factors that we must consider when studying social influence. This is going to have a particular focus on the social, cultural and ethical impacts of Indigenous groups. This is part of the social influence topic for Stage 2 Psychology. Let's get started. So it's necessary to study social influence, and as I've said here in my second dot point, we often use an observational research design. This increases the likelihood that it will be externally and ecologically valid. However, by doing so, we need to be very mindful of the social, cultural, and ethical implications of conducting such research with Indigenous groups. What we want to avoid is something called ethnocentric bias. This is when an individual is culturally biased towards their own culture. An inability to examine other ethnic groups without comparing their own cultural practices can lead to people making negative or biased judgments regarding differing cultures. So let's now take a look at the ethical implications of studying Indigenous cultures. According to the National Statement of Australian Research Guidelines, researchers must respect and support research participants with additional elements and nuances found in ethical guidelines for research with Indigenous peoples and communities. All research involving Indigenous peoples must be reviewed and approved by a registered Human Research Ethics Committee. It must include assessment by or advice from people who have networks with and knowledge of research with Indigenous peoples and people familiar with the culture and practices of the people with whom participation in the research will be discussed. So, let's look at informed consent specifically. Typically, psychological research requires the participant to sign documentation regarding consent to engage in the research, as we know, consent forms. However, in rural areas, there is high incidences of where Indigenous people are not able to read or comprehend the information. Towery in 2017 has argued that when research with Indigenous groups occur, if an elder has agreed to speak with the researcher about their culture, then this should be considered absolute consent. It's also important to ensure that Indigenous communities have access to translators, interpreters, and advocates to ensure the participants and their culture are supported while gaining empirical evidence. There is an increasing demand for social research and data in psychology that goes beyond the westernized, typical, educated, and rich populations. If there is one message that emerges from this process, it's that one should never assume that a research method or instrument will have the same meaning cross-culturally. So what happens or what occurs for one culture may be interpreted very differently with a different culture. Most of the research on Indigenous communities and individuals is contaminated with Eurocentric bias. So going forward, more emphasis needs to be placed on diversity rather than universality. I hope you found that video useful. As always, any questions, let me know. Otherwise, happy revising.